what's up? This is Myles Munroe Jr. I want to welcome you to the new episode of the Myles High Podcast. As you know, in this podcast, the vision and goal is to entertain, educate, and elevate you miles high above your fears, your doubts, and any limitations that you may think exist, always knowing that those limitations only exist in your mind. All right? So today I have a quick pod, right? I have this topic that I want to discuss. I just felt it would be good to bring this to the pod today. I think it'll make for a good conversation, right? So the topic that I want to discuss today is tradition isn't for everyone. All right, tradition isn't for everyone. I want to start with two stories, right? The first story dates back to when I was about 13 years old, and my family and I were gathered around the dinner table, or lunch table, one Sunday afternoon. We had some guests over to the house that day. And we were enjoying, lunch that day. And one of the guests, this gentleman that was there, wanted to seek some advice from my dad about a job opportunity that he had, right? And my dad asked him a bit of history of, his current job. He was currently employed, and he had an opportunity that came up that he didn't know if he should take it or not. And he wanted to ask my dad's advice on it. So my dad asked him some history about, his current job, how long he was on it, what is it about this new job that is enticing him and why he wants to leave and whatever. And then my dad kind of answered him. So my dad never really answers directly. I'd say about maybe 70% of the time he does not answer you directly, right? He gives recommendations, and then he may use an illustration. This particular day, he used an illustration. And this illustration has always stuck with me, right? It's something that I've never forgotten because it impacted me, when my dad said it. So we were gathered around a lunch table. My dad took the table salt, the salt shaker that was on the table, and he placed it in the center of where he was sitting at that end of the table. And he said, this table salt represent you. And he was pointing to the gentleman who was asking the advice, right? And he said, you're starting in this position, right? And he started to move the table salt around to various points on the table, right? So he moved it to the left of where it initially was, and he moved it to the right of where it initially was. Then he moved it up, and then he moved it above where it initially was, and he moved it below it where it initially was. He moved it diagonally. He moved it horizontally. He just started to move it like in different spots, right? So after about 30 seconds of this, he kind of illustrated that the table salt was covering a good amount or percentage of the table because it was moving in these various positions, right? But while it was moving, obviously the spot that it moved from, it was no longer, impacting or influencing because it had moved to a different spot, right? And my dad says, we can do this as individuals, describing the illustration that he was doing, moving the table salt around. He said, we can go to all these different points and these positions and these places, and we can have an impact, right? We can have an impact everywhere we are, everywhere we move. We can have an impact, we can have influence over those that are directly around us, right? And then he said, and then he moved the table spot back to the initial position where he had initially started. And instead of moving around, he just started to lift the table salt slowly off of the table, right? And lifted in a straight line above the table. So as he kept moving the table salt up, what you saw was the shadow of the table salt then start to cover or be shown on the table, on the dinner table. So the higher he went, the larger the shadow got, right? The higher he went, the larger the shadow got. So you saw he ultimately, was able to stretch his hand way up in the air, and the shadow of the table salt was covering a pretty large mass of the table. And his description was, or you can stay in one position and ascend in that position, right? Be promoted, gain notoriety, gain all of these accolades in this one position, and you can keep ascending, and your influence naturally will cover a larger mass of persons or individuals or of space the higher you go, right? So the illustration there essentially was, he was recommending that instead of trying to like move to these different jobs and get the title that you want, you kind of stay in the job market or the job that you are currently in, and work your butt off to ascend and excel in that position, right? And as you get promoted and as you do well in that position, you would eventually be able to cover or attain a large amount of success and a large amount of impact and influence over that territory that you're covering because of your ascension. So that story always stuck out to me, right? That kind of changed my perspective. At 13 years old, right, I started to gain an understanding of, man, it's good to kind of grow where you're planted, in a sense, right? That's kind of the terminology that I've grown to describe what that story was that my dad was describing, right? What he was illustrating. Grow where you're planted. Allow your roots to get a hole in the ground and allow your tree to grow. And as you grow, like, you cover a large mass of the territory that's around you. Okay, so that's the first story. The second story I wanted to illustrate, and this will make sense in a couple of minutes, right? So the second story I wanted to illustrate was a friend of mine. Was a couple of years ago, I'd say maybe about 10 years ago or 11 years ago, 12 years ago, something along those lines. He was in a position at a job. He had just left a job that he was in, or that he was at, for about 2 to 3 years. He got into this new job that he was in for, I'd say, no longer than 6 months, right? And he had this new job opportunity that came up, and he was making the decision to leave this current job that he was in for 6 months and, get into this new company. And, the minute, like, we had a discussion about it, he was just kind of telling us, like, what he was thinking about doing, not really asking for advice, but how, like, friends talk, like, yo, this is what I'm thinking. I think this would be a good move. I like the opportunities on this job. And, as we were having that conversation, my mind automatically went back to that illustration that my dad gave, right? And the idea of, growing where you're planted, right? And I remember, like, I didn't tell my friend, like, he shouldn't move, but I told him, like maybe you should think about, like, staying where you're at and kind of excelling there, right? Because the job was with a great firm. This new job was at a more at a newer firm, a firm that was kind of establishing themselves. But this job that he was at right now was at a much more well-known brand name firm. So I kind of was like, maybe you should stay and kind of grow where you're at. And, as you ascend, you will, hopefully more opportunities will come. Well, needless to say, my boy didn't listen, and he decided to take the new job. So he left the job that he was at for 6 months, moved to this new organization, and he's been there ever since, right? He's been there for the space of 12 years. And in those, maybe 13 years now, 14 years, whatever the time period is, within that time period, he's become super successful within that at that job, right? And he has reached a level, an officer level within that organization, making some great money, able to support his family, just doing, like, super well. And I had a conversation with him recently, and he was just telling me how how much he's matured over the years, and he's taken on so much more responsibility, at this job. And, I've seen it over the years, but this is the first time we've actually been able to talk about it. And he just expressed how, this company, he's had opportunities to leave before, but decided not to, just because of, I guess still the possibility that the company still has to grow and do well and do better. And I couldn't think nothing more than to say, man, I am so glad that my boy did not listen to me when I told him or when I suggested he shouldn't take this new job, right? Because, that I started to now realize that, man, had I given him that advice, right, or had he taken the advice that I was giving him, where would his life be, right? Where would he be professionally? Where would he be within his family life? What would the trajectory of his life had been had he not taken this new job, right? And it just keeps reminding me about, things that we've learned, right? The traditions that we've learned, the things that we've been taught as we were growing up, and we've kind of taken hold of them, and we want to extend those traditions and those beliefs and those ideas onto those around us that we care about and that we love, right? But sometimes those traditions just doesn't work. It doesn't fit any and everybody, right? I think a good example of this, again, my dad, let me first off start with, my dad did a teaching on tradition, right? And he took it from the angle of like crisis, right? And how crisis comes to challenge and change traditions, right? Sometimes we get so stuck in being so traditional in the way that we do things and how we think and what we say, that we get lost in the tradition and not think about the progress that we're not achieving, right? Or the stagnancy that we are in because we're becoming so traditional in the things that we do. And he went back, my dad went back to the book of Judges, right? In the good book. And he looked at Judges chapter 50. And this is the story of Samson, right? This is where Samson had 1,000 Philistines in the front of him who wanted to kill him. And Samson had to do something about it, right? It was either flight or fight at that time. And Samson chose to fight. What he did was he picked up a jawbone of a donkey, used it as a weapon, and was able to defeat 1,000 Philistines, right? But there's a portion of this verse that, in one of my dad's teachings, like he pointed it out, and it changed my mind when it came to like tradition and the way that we view tradition. So I'm going to pick up Judges 15, verse 15. It says, finding a fresh jawbone of a donkey, he grabbed it and struck down 1,000 men. Excuse me. Then Samson said, with a donkey's jawbone, I have made donkeys of them. With a donkey's jawbone, I have killed 1,000 men. When he finished speaking, he threw away the jawbone, and the place was called Ramath-Lehi. Now, the most important part of this verse is verse 17, when it says, when he finished speaking, he being Samson, he threw away the jawbone. Now, throwing away the jawbone, right, was something significant to me, because here you have Samson, who had just defeated 1,000 men, not with a sword, not with a spear, not with a gun. He used something that no one would have thought to use in a battle when you were facing 1,000 offenders, right? He used a jawbone. I think traditionally what we would do as human beings, right, is, if I was able to defeat 1,000 men with this jawbone, I'm going to take this jawbone, I'm going to patent it, I'm going to sell this patent, I'm going to say, this jawbone was able to defeat 1,000 men, you too can defeat 1,000 men, right? And we're going to use that as our sales pitch to sell this tradition or this trade that we're able to send around and sell off to these like armies or whatever who could make use of this jawbone the way that I or Samson did. But Samson didn't do any of that, right? He threw away the jawbone. And that's significant because it shows that sometimes the things that we're using or the things that we're making use of within a specific time period is only for that time period. And once that time period is finished, we need to do away with the things that we've used, right? And start to discover and use new utensils and new tools within the new environment that we're in, right? We shouldn't continue to trade off these traditionally used methods, skill sets, principles, or whatever it is that we've been passing down from generation to generation, in kind of selling that, because it worked for me, it'll work for you, right? I don't think it works like that. This also reminds me of the story of David, right? When David went to defeat Goliath, right? There was, his brothers were in the army, and all the other soldiers in the army were terrified of Goliath. But David wasn't terrified. David went to King Saul and was like, I'm gonna take on this giant. Since everyone else is scared, I'll do it, right? I've defeated lions, I've defeated bears on my own as a young boy. Like, I don't see any difference between them that I've already defeated and this Goliath. So King Saul was like, all right, cool, I'm going to allow you to do this, but, I want to give you my armor, right? I want you to use my armor to go out and fight this Goliath, because this is the way we fight. This is what we use. This is how we dress. These are the things that we put on as we go out to battle, right? And David obliged him, put on the armor of King Saul, but realized that, man, this armor is bearing me down, right? This is too heavy. This is, I'm too young for this. I'm too weak for this. This armor isn't helping me the way that it helped you. And he told King Saul, man, I can't use this. Like this traditional way of dressing in battle that you use isn't going to work for me, and I have to do it my way, right? So he took off the armor of King Saul, and we know the rest of the story. He went out and defeated Goliath. And again, it's ignoring the tradition or the ways that have been successful or common within a generation or within a particular environment, and kind of taking on our own traditions, right? And doing things not necessarily entirely different from what it used to be done, but doing them the way that it works for us. Now, this isn't to say that tradition isn't good, right? I'm in no way saying that everyone should ignore tradition, right? Tradition works for some people. Tradition works for people who need a little bit of structure or need a little bit of normalcy, right, within their life or within their profession. Tradition isn't a bad thing. I don't think that we should do away with all of tradition. I just think that there comes a time where we need to really look deep inside ourselves and decide, is this thing that I'm doing, even though we did this traditionally, historically, this is what we've been doing, is this still working? I, as a leader in the organizations that I run, one of the things that a lot of my staff and the people that I work with know that I hate to hear is, well, we did this last year, or we used to do this in the past. Like that statement irks me for the mere fact that, man, I don't care what we did in the past. This is an entirely new year. This is an entirely new opportunity for us to better what it is that we've done in the past, right? So I don't care what we did last year. I don't care what we did 2 years ago. And I don't care how successful it was when we did it. I'm still open and eager to challenge myself, continue to challenge myself, and not focus on what we did and how we did it in the past, but focus on, man, what can I do to take what I did in the past and either better it or try something entirely different. And that's why I feel like, tradition isn't for everyone. Now, it works for some people, like continually doing repeated things. And, if they're successful, obviously you would continue and not change things. But there are those individuals like myself who love challenges, number one, right? And then we always look at things as, there's always a million ways to skin a cat. And I think that, not saying that we should do away with tradition, but we should relook at tradition every time the opportunity comes up, to see if the tradition that we're using or the thing that we're doing, whether that is still successful or effective in whatever it is that we're trying to accomplish. So my challenge here isn't to do away with tradition, but it's just to understand that, man, tradition isn't for everyone, right? So I implore persons in my generation, as you have kids, and as you rear these kids and train and teach them as they grow and learn and develop, let's not thrust our traditions and the way that we did things as we grew up in our adult life onto our kids, onto the generation behind us, because sometimes it just doesn't work, right? Going back to the story of my dad, and the salt and his recommendation to that gentleman, that advice might have worked for that particular gentleman, right? Because it's good advice, right? I do see the success rate in persons who are staying put, growing their roots there, and excelling in their positions or in their organizations. I have another friend who, didn't change jobs, has been with this particular company he's been at for over 15 years, and he has been super successful. He is, one step on the C-suite level in the corporation that he's working for. Super successful, right? And then I have the friend that I told the story about in the beginning who left the job after being on that job for 6 months. And, there's no telling what would have happened if he had stayed at that job and secured his roots. But I see the success that he has had in this new job. over the years, right? And, you know, traditionally the advice would have been, my advice to him would have been, man, you should stay there and kind of grow in this job. But I think the better advice, or the best advice the best decision that he could have made was to really, you know, take on the opportunity that was in front of him, go to this new job and establish himself there. So I think he did a good job at it. Again, this is just to point out that tradition isn't for everyone, right? It is for some people. I'm not saying that it isn't. But there are some of us who don't want to do things the way they were traditionally done, right? We like to discover new ways of doing things, discover new outcomes that are possible in these new ways of doing things, and try to create new traditions, you know, ultimately. I think that tradition is good, but sometimes tradition needs to be challenged. And I am always up for the challenge. All right. So that's just me wanting to, you know, discuss a topic that has been helpful to me. And I just, you know, I love to share these principles and these thoughts with you guys as we go through this journey of this podcast. And I'm always grateful that you guys are joining me on this. All right. Okay. So this brings us to the part of the pod where I leave with you a milestone. Today's milestone is pretty simple, right? Sometimes crisis comes to challenge tradition, right? There's these turmoils in our lives that happen, that we experience, and it forces us to figure things out. And the figuring out of it forces us to think of different ways to do things that we've been doing, right? There are times in our lives where, you know, we've been doing the same things over and over, becoming redundant, maybe even becoming complacent in what it is that we're doing. And crisis happens, you know, these unexpected occurrences happen to challenge us in those exact moments. And it's up to us to be up for the challenge and to think of new ways to do the same things we've been doing, because there's always a million ways to skin a cat. All right. That's one thing I love to say, one thing I believe in wholeheartedly. And I just wanted to leave that with you guys. So maybe in some of your situations, you could adopt that same mentality. All right. So that brings us to the end of the pod today. Thank you for joining me. Thank you for listening. Yo, let's have a discussion about this. If you want to leave a comment or shoot me an email, by all means do so. I promise I'm going to respond. We can have a discussion about it if you feel differently. I'm always open for a debate, a good, healthy debate. All right. Looking forward to hearing from you guys. But as you know, on this pod, the goal is to always entertain, educate, and elevate you miles high above your fears, your doubts, and any limitations that you may think exist. Always knowing that those limitations only exist in your mind. Until next time, you guys stay blessed.